I successfully stand my ground against the HOA when they try to build a golf course on my land without permission, only to discover I hold the crucial water rights they desperately need. After a tense legal battle, they're forced to restore my property and compensate me, proving that unwavering resolve and knowledge of one's rights can topple even the most powerful opposition. But before we dive in, drop a comment below and tell me where you're tuning in from today. Let's begin. I remember the jolt of panic I felt the day I found a fleet of bulldozers rumbling across my front yard at 6 in the morning. Although the sun was only just cracking the horizon, the roar of diesel engines felt like thunder shaking the floor beneath my bare feet. I rushed outside in my pajamas, heart pounding with a mix of alarm and disbelief. Men in orange vests were shouting orders, and my century-old oak tree, planted by my grandfather when he first built the house, had a bright red X spray-painted on its trunk. The dreaded letters HOA were emblazoned on the sides of the trucks, and although it was early, half my neighbors had come to watch the commotion. My mind spun, and I called out, "Who gave you permission to dig up my land?" That was when one of the men, wearing a hard hat that sat askew over his curly brown hair, turned toward me and shrugged, saying something about official approval and community development. But all I heard was static in my head as I saw my lawn torn apart. 3 days before, I'd seen a small notice in our local HOA newsletter about a brand new golf course initiative. I recall flipping through it without much thought, figuring they had found some open space or farmland farther down the county line. Our homeowners association had been abuzz with the rumor of a recreational project aimed at enticing retirees and golf enthusiasts. Nothing in the short paragraph implied they were about to set up shop on my personal property. After all, I had never signed any documents granting them access. There was no reason for me to suspect that my own acreage would become ground zero for backhoes and excavation crews. Yet here they were, bright and early, acting as though they owned the deed to my land. As I confronted them, they seemed annoyed rather than apologetic, which only fueled my anger. My voice trembled as I asked if they had a court order or some formal arrangement with me. The foreman, exuding an air of impatience, waved a rolled-up paper in my face, claiming it was official. When I snatched it away, I realized it was a half-baked plan with a few scribbles, nowhere near a legitimate permit. My name is David Carmichael, and this is my story of how the HOA built a massive golf course on my property, only to find out they owed me a fortune for all the water rights. Of course, I didn't know that last part at the time. On that first morning, all I knew was that an injustice was unfolding right before my eyes. Fueled by outrage and panic, I told them in no uncertain terms to leave immediately, yet they refused to budge, insisting they had the green light from higher up. I dialed the local police department only for an officer to explain somewhat sympathetically that land disputes often need to go through civil channels rather than an immediate law enforcement response. My blood pressure soared. My property had been in my family for 4 generations, and I'd never imagined I'd have to fight an association I'd paid dues to for years just to keep my own front yard intact. Although I desperately wanted to stay home and defend my land, I had to drive to an important work meeting that morning. I remember getting into my old pickup truck, heart hammering so loud that I could barely hear the radio. I told the workers they'd better not remove a single blade of grass while I was gone, but they only offered thin-lipped grins. Slamming the truck door, I sped away, wondering how everything had escalated so quickly. No matter how many cups of coffee I downed, my mind raced in circles, unable to focus on anything but the gnawing fear that my beloved property would be unrecognizable by the time I returned. That afternoon, I decided to do something more drastic. I drove to City Hall, fuming and determined to speak with someone in charge of permits or zoning. After waiting nearly an hour in a cramped lobby with fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I finally sat down with an official who looked overwhelmed by the towering stack of papers on her desk. She furrowed her brow at my story, typed some notes into her computer, and eventually frowned, explaining that the city had never issued any official permit for golf course construction on my parcel. "They're definitely operating outside standard procedure," she said in a cautious tone, "but the HOA sometimes has special agreements with property owners who may not be fully aware." My stomach sank. Was she implying that I had somehow signed away my rights without knowing it? She kindly advised me to check every piece of documentation associated with my home purchase, inheritance, and the local covenants. With new dread pooling in my gut, I headed to the county clerk's office, determined to unravel this mystery before the bulldozers did irreversible damage. While searching through archived documents, I found my grandfather's original deed from 70 years ago. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but the language was clear. The land was absolutely ours, free and clear, with no mention of an easement or a condition that would allow any third party to build a golf course. The clerk, a kindly older gentleman with a thick white mustache, read over my shoulder and offered a sympathetic smile. "It looks like you own this land outright," he assured me. "If the HOA never negotiated an amendment, then you have every right to tell them to back off." Armed with this knowledge, I drove home in a swirl of conflicting emotions: relief, anger, and a burning desire to put the HOA in its place. Yet, a part of me felt uneasy. Why on earth would the association start construction with no legal basis? It felt too brazen, even for them. When I turned onto my street, I saw a fresh mound of dirt at the edge of my yard and my mailbox knocked over. My eyes darted to a sign planted crookedly in the grass: "Coming soon, Maplewood HOA Golf Club." Red-hot anger prickled my skin. I jumped out of the truck and sprinted toward the sign, yanking it out with such force that it splintered in half. A couple of neighbors stood watching from across the road, their expressions a mix of pity and concern. Strangely, though no construction crew was present at that moment, the heavy machinery was gone, leaving behind an ugly scar in the earth. I paced around the yard, shaking, holding a broken sign in my hands. That was the moment I resolved to do whatever it took. The HOA had crossed a line, and I wasn't about to let them skate by without repercussions. To understand how we got to the explosive confrontation that followed, I need to rewind to a conversation I had with a longtime friend, Henry Fletcher, a local attorney. Henry had grown up next door to me. We used to race our bikes around the block and talk about everything from baseball cards to the meaning of life. Over the years, Henry had become a well-respected lawyer in our county, specializing in real estate disputes. When I phoned him in a state of panic, he told me to bring every scrap of paper I had, including the old deed, to his office. Feeling oddly hopeful, I spread documents across his glossy conference table. Henry's expression shifted from mild curiosity to deep concern as I explained the situation. When I told him about the bulldozers and the sign, he slammed his palm on the table. "They can't just seize your property like that," he exclaimed. "It's trespassing at the very least." He suggested sending a cease and desist letter to the HOA, demanding they halt construction until we could sort out the legalities. We also discussed the possibility of filing a restraining order. My mind whirred, imagining my yard as a war zone where I'd stand guard day and night to stop intruders. But Henry was more strategic. "We'll handle this calmly and through proper channels," he assured me. "That's how we show them we mean business." Despite my emotional turmoil, I knew Henry's approach was right, yet I still shook with rage whenever I glanced out my window at the newly flattened patches of grass. Years of memories. Family picnics, my son's first steps, my grandparents' old porch swing, flashed through my mind, fueling my resolve to fight back. However, the next morning brought a startling twist. An HOA board member named Cynthia Reynolds arrived at my doorstep. She was impeccably dressed in a navy blue pantsuit, her expression smug beneath her expertly applied makeup. Without even waiting for an invitation, she strode into my living room, her heels clacking on the hardwood floor. She tried to hand me a glossy brochure that displayed a smiling couple swinging golf clubs against a picturesque green. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," she began in a condescending tone. "We have every right to use this land for community development," I replied with a frosty glare, explaining how I'd discovered no legal basis for their claim. Undeterred, she pointed out a complicated passage in some addendum to the Homeowners Association rules, suggesting that because my property was within the Maplewood district, It was subject to certain improvements for the greater good. I laughed out loud, the bitterness raw in my throat. That piece of text was flimsy at best, and Henry's legal expertise would tear it to shreds in court. But Cynthia just smiled as if she'd already won. Before she left, she dropped a hint that unsettled me. "We do hope you'll cooperate. It'd be a shame if certain amenities or services were to be withheld for non-compliance," she said, voice dripping with veiled threat. I watched her depart in a sleek luxury car, frustration coiling in my stomach like a venomous snake. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, control, and intimidation. In that moment, I realized that the HOA was bigger, richer, and more influential than I'd ever imagined, and they were fully prepared to bulldoze me, figuratively and literally, to get their project done. An unsettling week passed. My attorney had issued the cease and desist, but the HOA construction group merely paused for a couple of days before resuming. They moved more discreetly, often working at odd hours, trying to avoid direct confrontation. One night, around midnight, I heard machinery clanking in the distance and saw floodlights illuminating the back portion of my property. I stumbled out there, flashlight in hand, only to be met with blank stares and shrugs from the laborers. They showed me no permits, no authorizing documents. When I threatened to call the police, they continued their work anyway. A deputy who arrived an hour later offered little immediate relief, instead echoing that all land disputes must be settled in court. Fury boiled in my veins as I felt my control over my own property slipping away. In those tense days, I slept fitfully, waking up to the rumble of trucks and the whine of power tools. The stress weighed on me, and I found it hard to concentrate on my job. My boss grew concerned about my performance, and friends started urging me to consider a settlement. Yet the more I learned about the HOA's underhanded tactics, the more determined I became to stand my ground. Still, nothing could have prepared me for the bizarre and game-changing discovery I stumbled upon one afternoon in the dusty recesses of the local library. I'd gone there to research property lines and water rights, suspecting there might be some angle I could use in my favor. Little did I know that angle would turn out to be a seismic legal advantage. I was flipping through old maps, eyes bleary from scanning the tiny print, when I noticed something intriguing. The land my grandfather had purchased was bordered by a natural spring that fed into a creek meandering through several counties. Buried in the fine print of an old local ordinance, it stated that owners of that specific stretch of land possessed exclusive rights to the spring's water usage. My pulse quickened as I realized this might mean I held the key to controlling water supply for whatever enterprise dared to operate on my property. If the HOA wanted to build a golf course, a notoriously water-intensive project, they would need a massive, continuous supply to keep the greens lush. And guess who owned the water? Eager to confirm my suspicion, I met with a water rights specialist recommended by Henry. The specialist's eyes lit up when he saw the documents, explaining that those water rights were indeed quite valuable. Without your explicit permission, no one can extract, channel, or redirect water from that spring, he said, his voice tinged with excitement. Suddenly, my frustration transformed into cautious hope. The HOA, brazen as it was, would find itself in a legal quagmire if I enforced my rights. Without water, their fancy golf course would wither into a patch of dust. The question was, would they back off, or would they try to steamroll me further? Emboldened, I contacted Henry, who immediately saw the significance. He drafted a new set of legal documents asserting my exclusive rights to the water source. We filed an injunction preventing any further use of my water for the golf course, effectively pulling the plug on their operation. The next morning, I woke to find that the bulldozers were gone. No lights, no tools, no workers. For the first time in weeks, I breathed a small sigh of relief. It seemed the HOA had finally realized they couldn't ignore the law without consequences. However, something in my gut warned me this was just the calm before the storm. A few days later, my mailbox, recently reinstalled, was stuffed with official-looking envelopes. One came from the HOA labeling me uncooperative and threatening fines for non-compliance. Another was from a law firm representing the association, demanding I rescind the water injunction. My anger flared all over again, but Henry told me to remain patient. "We have the upper hand," he reminded me. "They can threaten all they want, but without water, there's no golf course." He was right, of course. The fight was far from over, but at least we had leverage now. Over coffee, we strategized about next steps. Perhaps we could even sue them for the damage they'd already inflicted on my land. My property was now dotted with half-finished putting greens, piles of gravel, and patches of churned-up mud, and my beloved oak tree stood ominously with that red X, a constant reminder that the association had planned to cut it down any day. All at once the story jumped forward. About 2 weeks later, I found myself in a tense mediation session at the county courthouse. The room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale air conditioning. On one side of the long wooden table sat Henry and me, each with a stack of evidence. On the other side were 2 HOA representatives, including Cynthia Reynolds, along with their polished attorney. A court-appointed mediator kept glancing at the clock, evidently eager to wrap up the proceedings before lunchtime. My heart hammered as we presented our case. Henry meticulously laid out the deed, the lack of permission, the water rights documents. With each fact, Cynthia's smug expression grew more strained. Their attorney countered that we were obstructing a public amenity that promised economic benefits, but Henry calmly reiterated that public amenities don't supersede private property rights. Finally, the mediator asked if we could reach any compromise. I stared at the scowl on Cynthia's face and told her bluntly, "I'd rather see every inch of grass on this property die than let you barge in without consent." Was that dramatic? Maybe, but I was tired of intimidation. To my surprise, they pivoted and offered to buy the land outright. "We'll give you a generous sum for the acreage," their attorney said, sliding a piece of paper with a figure that was high, shockingly high. For a flicker of a moment, I was tempted. The money could have solved countless problems, maybe let me retire early. But I pictured my grandfather's face, recalling the vow I made to keep the property in our family. Without hesitating, I declined. The mediator sighed, sensing the standoff. 2 days later, the HOA tried a different tactic. They called a special meeting inviting local residents, presumably to rally support against me. I decided to attend, bracing myself for a potential ambush. The community center was packed. Various residents took turns standing at a microphone to voice their opinions. Some were outraged at the idea of losing a golf course. "My son was going to practice his swing there," one woman lamented. Others, especially those who lived near me, expressed concerns about property values and noise pollution from the construction. A few supported me, stressing that no association had the right to steal land. Cynthia moderated the meeting with an artificial smile, letting people vent. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the microphone, my legs shaking slightly. I tried to explain the legal basis for my stance, but a cacophony of boos erupted from a group of retirees in the back, chanting something about progress and community improvement. My anger flared, but I remained calm. Eventually, the meeting ended without resolution, just a swirl of frustrated voices echoing in the room. Tension boiled in my neighborhood. Several times as I strolled down the street, I felt people glare at me from behind half-drawn curtains. One neighbor, who had always been friendly, stopped chatting with me altogether. Another left a rude note taped to my door, accusing me of holding the entire HOA hostage. But I also received supportive messages, handwritten letters from folks who believed the association was overstepping. Some praised my courage, saying they felt too intimidated to speak up. Their notes reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was challenging an oppressive system that relied on fear and manipulation. The more I realized this, the stronger my resolve became. Then came the twist I never saw coming, which was about to flip the entire situation on its head. Late one night, I received an unexpected phone call from a journalist named Tracy Marshall, who worked for the local TV station. She wanted to interview me about a major scandal brewing within the HOA. Apparently, her confidential source claimed that the association had been misappropriating funds for this golf course, forging signatures to gain access to land they didn't lawfully control. Tracy asked if I'd be willing to go on record, share my story, and possibly help expose corruption that ran far deeper than my isolated case. Though hesitant at first, I wasn't one for media attention. I realized shining a public spotlight might be the only way to protect my property from clandestine maneuvering. I agreed, and the next morning Tracy arrived with a camera crew and microphone. We talked for an hour about my grandfather's legacy, the bulldozers, and the water rights that could make or break the project. The televised segment aired 2 nights later, and it made waves throughout the county. Suddenly, I was inundated with phone calls and emails from people who'd had their own run-ins with the HOA. Some alleged that the board had coerced them into paying additional maintenance fees under false pretenses. Others claimed their property lines had been arbitrarily redefined to favor association projects. My story had ignited a spark, and soon the flames of public outrage began to grow. I found myself in an odd position, someone who'd only wanted to preserve his land but was now at the center of a much larger fight. As public scrutiny intensified, the HOA's once confident stance began to crack. Cynthia, who used to show up at my doorstep radiating smugness, now avoided me entirely. Instead, I received a formal invitation to a closed-door meeting with the association's executive board. Henry insisted on attending alongside me. We arrived at their imposing brick office building on a sunny Wednesday afternoon, stepping into a conference room with a long mahogany table. Around it sat half a dozen board members, each wearing an expression that fluctuated between panic and irritation. Their attorney was present too, flipping nervously through a stack of paperwork. Right away, the head of the board cut to the chase. They admitted that the construction had overstepped its bounds. They also conceded that forging the necessary permissions had been a serious oversight. In the next breath, they insisted that they still believed the golf course would be mutually beneficial and offered to negotiate terms for water usage. Henry and I exchanged glances, stifling the urge to laugh. After all we'd been through, after their threats and bullying, they wanted me to gift them my water rights so they could salvage their project. They even dangled an offer of partial profits from the golf course, plus a year of free membership, an absurd perk given that I don't even play golf. Sensing I was about to reject them outright, they then tried a different angle, claiming the entire community was counting on me. My response was curt. Maybe the community shouldn't rely on illegal land grabs for entertainment. Surprisingly, they didn't storm out. Instead, the head of the board cleared his throat and hinted that the HOA's finances were precarious. They'd sunk large sums of money into the project, money that might be unrecoverable if they failed to complete the course. In other words, they were in a bind. With the media spotlight now glaring on them, they were desperate for a lifeline. Looking at Henry, I realized we possessed immense power to dictate terms, but I was torn. Part of me wanted to see them squirm for all the grief they'd caused. Another part just wanted my land restored to its original condition, my life returned to normal. We demanded they immediately cease any further construction, remove all equipment, and restore my property. Furthermore, we insisted they pay for the repairs. The board members squirmed in their seats, exchanging nervous looks. That's when Henry introduced the nuclear option, a formal lawsuit for trespassing, property damage, and emotional distress. The potential damages were staggering. Even if the HOA survived the public relations disaster, they might not withstand the financial blow. Their attorney went pale, realizing the precariousness of their situation. Suddenly, we held every card. It felt surreal given how powerless I'd felt just weeks earlier. At that juncture, the matter of water rights took center stage. I made it abundantly clear that I wouldn't sign away those rights without an astronomical offer, if at all. Henry added that we'd consult an environmental specialist to determine if a golf course would even be sustainable given the local ecosystem. While the board members fidgeted, Cynthia, who'd been silent until then, finally spoke up. She claimed that the community had been misled, that she wasn't fully aware of all the shady machinations. I didn't buy it for a second. Yet, I noticed the sweat beading on her forehead as she tried to salvage her reputation. Her usual condescension had vanished, replaced by a desperate humility. By the end of the meeting, no final deal was reached, but they agreed to halt construction and discuss settlement terms with Henry. Walking out of that conference room, I felt a sense of relief mingled with a pinch of disbelief. Had we really turned the tables on the almighty HOA? Nothing was certain yet, but we were finally on the offensive. For the first time in months, I slept a full night without awakening to the nightmare of bulldozers outside my window. Then came the day of reckoning, an official hearing at the county courthouse. The scandal had garnered substantial media attention, prompting the judge to schedule a public session. Dozens of people packed into the gallery. Reporters hovered near the back, cameras poised. On one side, the HOA's lawyer tried to paint the project as a well-intentioned plan that had been misunderstood. On our side, Henry laid out the evidence systematically, revealing forged documents, unauthorized land use, and blatant disregard for my property rights. The judge's disapproval grew more pronounced with every new revelation. There was a sharp intake of breath when Henry presented the original deed and water rights, underscoring that any future development relying on that water would need my explicit written consent. At the hearing's climax, the HOA's attorney tried a final gambit, an emotional appeal about how the community needed the golf course for seniors, for local children learning the sport, and so on. But the judge wasn't swayed by sentiment. He chastised the HOA for disregarding due process, for trampling on an individual's rights, and for their arrogance in trying to move forward without legal backing. In the end, he ruled that the HOA must pay to restore my land to its original condition, remove any and all structures that had been installed, and settle the matter of damages in an out-of-court agreement. As for the golf course, if they intended to proceed in some revised capacity, they'd have to renegotiate from square one, with me holding absolute control over the water rights. The judge's gavel slammed down, a satisfying echo of finality. Cameras flashed, capturing the looks of shock and dismay on the faces of several board members. You might think that was the happy ending, but there was a bit more. In the weeks following the hearing, lawyers for the HOA reached out to Henry with a substantial settlement offer, which included a significant sum for the infringement on my land and emotional distress. They also offered a monthly payment plan if, at some point in the future, they received permission to tap into my water supply for any scaled-down development. I took my time deciding. Ultimately, I accepted a financial settlement for the damage caused, but I refused to sign away my water rights. The property meant too much to me. I'd consider licensing a small portion of the water if they ever came to me with a transparent, community-beneficial proposal that didn't involve ravaging my acres. But that was a big if. I doubted I'd ever see such a plan from them. After the repair crews arrived, they worked for several weeks to restore my yard. The ugly piles of earth were smoothed over, new grass seed was planted, and my oak tree, thankfully never cut down, received professional care to ensure its longevity. Watching my land slowly return to normal felt like reclaiming a piece of my family's history. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months stopped by, sometimes just to wave or chat. Some even apologized for doubting me. Over time, the scandal forced a shakeup in the HOA leadership. Cynthia Reynolds and a few other key board members resigned amid ongoing investigations, replaced by individuals more attuned to the concerns of local residents. There was a cautious sense of optimism that maybe the HOA could evolve into a more ethical entity. A local news crew covered the aftermath. They captured footage of my newly replanted lawn, the old oak standing tall, and me smiling at the camera. The reporter asked if I had any lingering resentment. I simply explained that I'd be vigilant from now on, quick to call out any overreach. But as for grudges, I preferred to let the legal system and public scrutiny handle the rest. One thing was certain. The association wouldn't be laying down any golf courses on land they didn't own, not while the memory of this debacle was still fresh. Friends sometimes joke that I should charge admission for a tour of the land that brought the HOA to its knees. Of course, I politely decline, though I do find a certain humor in how everything unfolded. Life soon fell back into a calmer rhythm, the hum of passing cars replacing the clank of machinery. On weekends, I'd sit on my porch, sipping iced tea, appreciating the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves on that grand old oak, and the knowledge that I still had a future here. A future that my grandfather, if he were alive, would wholeheartedly approve of. Reflecting on the entire ordeal, I can't help but recall the sense of powerlessness I felt when I first saw those bulldozers. It's surreal to think how quickly the underdog story flipped once I discovered those water rights. But truth be told, the deeper satisfaction came not from the money or even from halting the project, but from standing up against an entity that believed it could ride roughshod over people just because it had wealth and influence. In challenging them, I learned how vital it is to protect what's yours and to remain steadfast even when facing seemingly insurmountable pressure. Of course, it wasn't all heroics on my part. I had moments of doubt, episodes of pure frustration. I nearly caved when they flashed big numbers in front of me. I was nervous about the ramifications for my career, my family, and my relationships within the neighborhood, but with every step I discovered fresh reserves of grit I didn't know I possessed. And in that sense, I owe the HOA an odd sort of gratitude. By pushing me so hard, they revealed the strength of my determination. Months later, on a crisp autumn day, I found myself revisiting the spot where my property's natural spring flows gently into the creek. I stood there, watching the water sparkle under the late afternoon sun, contemplating everything that water signified. For the golf course, it would have been a lifeline for manicured greens, a simple commodity to be piped across the fairways. For me, it was part of a heritage stretching back to my grandfather's time. As a child, I'd played along the creek's edge, hunting for frogs or skipping stones. Those memories shaped me, and it struck me how easily one can lose something precious if a powerful group decides to claim it for themselves, convinced that their project overrides your history. Rumors occasionally drift my way about the HOA's future plans. Some say they might still attempt a smaller golf course on a different piece of land, or transform the current construction site into a public park. Others whisper that they've lost so much money and credibility they might not initiate another big project for years. Either way, I no longer lose sleep over their ambitions. My property is mine, legally and morally, and we have the paperwork to prove it. If they ever try to push me again, they'll discover the old bulldozer fiasco taught me more than enough about self-advocacy. Henry, who'd become a local hero of sorts, joked that we should open a victory barbecue on the property and invite everyone except the old HOA board. We never did, mainly because I'm not one to gloat. Still, I appreciate the comedic release after months of tension. Sometimes laughter is the best way to process a tumultuous chapter. Life, of course, moves on. I still have to mow the lawn, file taxes, and wash dishes after dinner. But there's a newfound appreciation for the simple act of walking outside, barefoot in the grass, feeling the soil my grandfather once tilled. It's a primal connection, a reminder that some things are worth fighting for no matter how daunting the challenge. I think about folks who might face similar battles, those who get overshadowed by corporations, associations, or government entities. My experience encourages me to say, hold your ground, look for leverage, and believe you have the right to defend yourself. In the end, the greatest revelation wasn't just about property lines or water rights. It was about the importance of safeguarding one's dignity and values. So many people I encountered in this ordeal advised me to just give up, take the money. But I realized that legacy cannot be purchased. Once you sell off that heritage, you might never get it back. And yes, perhaps that perspective seems old-fashioned in a world that worships convenience and quick solutions. But that's exactly why it's so crucial to hold on to something lasting. From time to time, I'll see a neighbor pass by, wave and give me a knowing grin, like they remember what I stood up for and respect that I didn't bend. It's a quiet acknowledgement that I managed to protect my piece of this American tapestry, a corner of the world that holds decades of my family's labor and love. Let the HOAs of the world huff and puff about community improvements. If they truly want to improve the community, they'll learn to respect individual rights and collaborate openly, rather than hide behind bureaucracy and bulldozers. To those who watched from the sidelines, it might look like I won a David versus Goliath battle with one lucky break, stumbling upon those crucial water rights. But the truth is, luck only takes you so far. Persistence, the willingness to dig through old files, the courage to confront bigwigs at a board meeting, these things matter just as much as any hidden legal gem. If I'd rolled over at the first sign of trouble, the water rights detail might have never surfaced. So if there's a lesson here, it's that destiny favors those who refuse to surrender, even when the odds are stacked against them. I often imagine how my grandfather would react if he saw the property now. I think he'd be proud, but he'd probably also offer a few gruff words about not letting people walk all over you in the first place. Grandpa had that old-school grit, a trait I suspect I inherited, though I rarely had reason to show it before this fiasco. Maybe everything happens for a reason. Maybe this challenge was my personal rite of passage, forcing me to grow beyond the comfortable assumptions I'd lived with for so long. One soft evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat on the porch and gazed out at my yard, now almost fully restored. The last patches of newly seeded grass had begun to sprout in a pale green fuzz, a fresh start on old ground. The oak tree rustled in a breeze, its branches strong and unbowed. In that quiet moment, a wave of gratitude washed over me. Gratitude for the chance to keep the land, yes, but also gratitude for the hard lessons learned. I realized I'd discovered a wellspring of resilience within myself. Land can be precious, but so is the unyielding spirit that defends it. These days, the bulldozers are gone, replaced by the normal rhythms of small-town life. Kids biking home from school, dogs barking in distant yards, neighbors exchanging polite nods under the glow of streetlights. I don't know what big scheme the HOA might concoct next, but I trust I'll be ready. My story traveled through the county, morphing into something of a local legend about how the little guy outsmarted the big association. Yet it's not purely a feel-good tale. Lives were disrupted, friendships tested, and trust eroded. But real growth rarely comes without discomfort. I walk forward with my head held high, aware that every acre under my boots is truly mine, carried by a lineage of perseverance that can't be bulldozed away. As I reflect on this odyssey, I want to leave you with a deeper message gleaned from the struggle. Sure, we can talk about the power of knowledge or the thrill of beating an institution at its own game, but at the core, what resonates most profoundly is the concept of standing firm in the face of injustice, trusting in your own moral compass when others might try to sway you with pressure, money, or intimidation. We live in a society that often prioritizes convenience over principle. This experience taught me that while compromise has its place, there comes a time when you must draw a line that cannot be crossed. It's in those moments of unwavering conviction that you discover who you truly are, and perhaps inspire others to rediscover their own courage too. That, in the end, might be the most valuable takeaway. We all have something that grounds us, a piece of our heritage or our identity that can't be bought or coerced away without a fight. Whether it's land, family traditions, or personal beliefs, knowing when to plant your feet and say no more is an act of self-preservation, a testament to the indomitable human spirit. The world might not always applaud you for it, but the quiet sense of dignity you gain is worth far more than any settlement check. Sometimes the price of preserving what matters most is nothing compared to the cost of letting it slip through your fingers. And that is why I can look out at my yard, once ravaged by heavy machinery, now teeming with new life, and feel a profound sense of peace. I didn't merely save some patches of grass or hold on to a water source. I reclaimed the essence of what this land meant to me and my family, and in doing so, I found a richer sense of belonging and responsibility. In the final reckoning, I would do it all over again if I had to, because protecting your roots isn't just about fighting an unjust HOA. It's about fighting for who you are. In a world that can be complicated, competitive, and sometimes downright ruthless, remember this lesson. Certain principles and treasures in life must never be surrendered without a stand. When you discover the line that cannot be crossed, you'll find a reservoir of fortitude you never knew you possessed. Hold tight to what's truly yours, whether it's literal land or the intangible fabric of your identity. Stand firm, stay vigilant, and let the bulldozers of adversity know that you are no easy target. If there's one enduring truth to emerge from my strange saga with the Maplewood HOA, it's that justice often belongs to those willing to search for it, fight for it, and defend it, even if the path is fraught with sleepless nights and anxious days. Ultimately, I hope my story resonates as a reminder that adversity can illuminate our inner strength, that a seemingly insurmountable challenge can be the catalyst for discovering new depths of courage and unity with others who share our values. Whatever your own personal battlefield might be, stand your ground with integrity. Let your convictions be a shield against those who would trample upon your rights. If you do, you might just uncover a hidden water right of your own, a potent advantage that only reveals itself to those brave enough to keep digging. And with that knowledge in hand, you stand tall, anchored by the quiet power of a legacy that cannot be stolen. Because in the grand scheme of life, what truly endures is the spirit that refuses to yield. And that is the profound lesson I leave you with. When you protect what matters most, you become unbreakable, forging an unassailable core of dignity that no bulldozer, no institution, no amount of money can tear asunder.